The metallic scrape of the trash can echoed through the cafeteria like a death rattle. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Patricia Dicks, blonde, blue uniform, prisoner 2009, moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. The inmates in blue parted for her like a sea. The ones in orange flinched. This was her kingdom. This was her ritual. But Lynette Lewis didn't flinch. She sat at the metal table, hands resting flat on either side of her untouched meal, her breathing measured and slow. No pleading. No trembling. Just that unnerving stillness, the kind that made predators second-guess their instincts. When Patricia upended the garbage can over Lynette's plate, rotten refuse spilling across the food in a cascade of humiliation, Lynette didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She simply looked up. And in that moment, something shifted in the air. Something cold. Something calculated. Patricia saw it. The way Lynette's eyes swept across her stance, her weight distribution, the micro-expressions that telegraphed every intention. These weren't the eyes of a victim assessing her attacker. These were the eyes of an operative running threat assessments. Eyes that had cataloged weaknesses before the first punch was even thrown. By the time Patricia understood what she was looking at, the damage was already done. And within 48 hours, every inmate in Riverbend Correctional would know the truth. They hadn't just mocked another prisoner. They'd poked a weapon that had chosen to stay sheathed. What happens when a woman trained to dismantle governments gets trapped in a place built to break spirits? You're about to witness the most intense psychological thriller of the year, where every calculated move, every silent observation, and every split-second decision could mean the difference between survival and total exposure. This isn't just another prison story. This is a masterclass in controlled violence, strategic dominance, and the terrifying power of someone who knows exactly how dangerous they are. Subscribe now and don't miss a single chapter. Because when Lynette finally moves, you won't want to blink. And when Patricia realizes who she's actually facing, you'll want to be there for every devastating second. Riverbend Women's Correctional Facility wasn't built for people like Lynette Lewis. It was built for the desperate, the violent, the broken. Women whose lives had fractured in ways the system couldn't repair, only contain. But Lynette hadn't fractured. She'd been forged, tempered, sharpened into something the other inmates couldn't recognize because they'd never seen it before. She'd arrived 3 weeks earlier with a prison number, a manufactured charge, and a silence so complete it unnerved even the guards. No friends. No enemies. No connections. She moved through the facility like smoke. Present but intangible, observing camera-blind spots, memorizing guard rotation schedules, mapping power hierarchies with the precision of someone trained to infiltrate hostile environments. The other inmates noticed, but they misread the signs. They saw a quiet black woman in an orange jumpsuit and assumed weakness. Isolation. Fear. They didn't see the 15 years of classified training. The missions in places that didn't exist on maps, the muscle memory that could drop a target before conscious thought caught up. They didn't know that Lynette's silence wasn't submission, it was operational security. And her stillness wasn't passivity, it was tactical patience. Patricia Dicks ruled Cell Block D through brutality and spectacle. She'd built her empire on fear, crushing anyone who threatened her dominance before they could gain traction. She had followers, weapons, connections with corrupt guards. She was untouchable, or so she believed. But when Patricia decided to make an example of Lynette Lewis that afternoon in the cafeteria, she didn't just start a confrontation. She activated something she couldn't control. She forced a shadow agent out of the dark. And once Lynette's training took over, once the muscle memory of joint locks and nerve strikes and psychological warfare protocols kicked in, there would be no putting that particular ghost back in the bottle. The trash can hit the floor with a hollow clang. The garbage settled over Lynette's meal like a declaration of war. And somewhere deep in Lynette's mind, behind the carefully constructed mask of the quiet inmate, a different protocol engaged. The kind that didn't end until the threat was neutralized. Hit that subscribe button. This story doesn't wait for anyone. The 72 hours she'd spent buried in a shipping container in Lagos. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to neutralize, to execute the 12 different takedown sequences her muscle memory had already calculated. But the mission required patience. The mission always required patience. She lifted her eyes slowly, deliberately, meeting Patricia's gaze with the kind of calm that came from watching warlords bleed out in dusty compounds. She'd been sent to Riverbend on a charge so manufactured it wouldn't survive a competent lawyer's lunch break. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, a paper-thin cover story built by handlers who needed her off the grid while a Senate investigation circled too close to operations that would never see daylight. 6 months, they'd promised. 6 months of silence while the heat died down and certain inconvenient senators found themselves distracted by other scandals. But 6 months required her to be invisible, forgettable, unremarkable. And Patricia Dicks had just made that impossible. Lynette registered the tells. The slight forward lean of Patricia's shoulders, the tightening of her jaw, the way her right hand was already curling into a fist. The woman was approximately 170 pounds, 5'9", with the heavy-shouldered build of someone who'd learned to fight in places where referees didn't exist. Dangerous to civilians. Predictable to someone who'd spent 15 years studying human weapons systems. "I'm just curious, Patricia," Lynette said, her voice carrying the same temperature as the steel table beneath her hands. "Does terrorizing new inmates give you the peace you lost on the outside?" The cafeteria held its breath. Even the guards stopped moving. Patricia's face flushed red, and Lynette added one more data point to her threat assessment. Emotional volatility, compromised tactical judgment, high probability of uncontrolled escalation. This was going to get messy, and there was absolutely nothing Lynette could do to stop it. Lynette had spent her first week at Riverbend mapping the facility's nervous system. She moved through the corridors like smoke, present but intangible, her footsteps falling in the gaps between guard rotations. 6:42 a.m., Officer Martinez began his rounds on the second tier. 7:15, the camera in the northeast corner of the recreation yard cycled to its blind spot for exactly 9 seconds. 9:30 p.m., the night supervisor disappeared into the staff bathroom for his cigarette break, leaving cell block D unwatched for 4.5 minutes. She cataloged everything. The way Patricia's crew assembled every morning in the shower room, their hierarchy clear in the spacing. Lieutenants close, foot soldiers keeping respectful distance. The blind spot behind the laundry facility where contraband changed hands. The specific cadence of keys that meant a shakedown was coming. Information was currency, and Lynette had been trained to bank it without spending a cent. Her cellmate, Clara, watched her with the wary fascination of someone who'd learned to read danger in small spaces. Clara was 53, serving year 9 of a 15-year bid for manslaughter. She'd seen women break, seen them harden, seen them die. But she'd never seen someone like Lynette. Someone who could sit motionless for 40 minutes straight, eyes tracking movement that Clara couldn't even detect. "You're gonna get yourself killed moving that quiet," Clara said one night, lying on her bunk while Lynette stood at the cell door, perfectly still, watching the guard station through the narrow window. "Patricia don't like ghosts in her house." Lynette didn't respond immediately. She waited until the guard's radio crackled with the hourly check-in, until his attention shifted to the clipboard in his hands. Only then did she step back from the door and turn to face Clara. "Noise attracts predators, Clara," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just making myself very boring." Clara snorted. "Boring? Girl, you move like you're hunting something. That ain't boring. That's dangerous." "Exactly." Lynette settled onto her bunk, her posture suggesting relaxation, while every muscle remained coiled and ready. "If I'm dangerous, I need to be forgettable. The moment someone decides I'm a threat, I become a target. You already are a target. Patricia's been watching you since you got here. She sees what I see, someone who don't fit. Someone who moves wrong." Clara's voice dropped lower. "What did you do out there? For real?" Lynette's expression never changed, but Clara saw the calculation behind her eyes. The split-second assessment of risk versus reward. The careful measurement of how much truth this conversation could afford. "I was good at my job," Lynette said finally. "Too good. So they gave me a different one." Clara wanted to press, Lynette could see it. But the older woman had survived 9 years by knowing when to stop asking questions. She rolled over on her bunk, facing the wall. "Well, your boring plan ain't working," Clara muttered. "Patricia's been asking around about you. Where you came from. What you did. She don't like mysteries, and you're the biggest one this place has seen in years." Lynette had known this was coming. She'd watched Patricia's information network operate with ruthless efficiency. The whispered conversations with trustees, the pressure applied to new inmates, the systematic collection of leverage and weakness. Patricia ran Cell Block D like an intelligence operation, which meant she'd inevitably recognize that Lynette was doing the same thing. The question was no longer if Patricia would move against her. The question was when, and whether Lynette could maintain her cover when the confrontation finally came. Outside their cell, footsteps echoed down the corridor. Lynette counted them automatically, 19 steps, the guard completing his rounds. The facility settled into its night rhythm, 1,000 women locked in steel boxes, each one navigating her own survival equation. Lynette closed her eyes and began her evening protocol. Mental review of guard schedules, threat assessments, contingency plans. She had 43 days left on her deployment timeline. She knew she wouldn't make it that long. Patricia Dicks hadn't built her empire by ignoring threats. She'd survived 8 years at Riverbend by recognizing challenges before they fully materialized, crushing potential rivals while they were still finding their footing. The system was simple: identify, isolate, humiliate, dominate. It had worked on 23 women before Lynette Lewis arrived. But Lynette was different. Wrong. Patricia watched her from across the day room, studying the way she moved through space like she owned it without ever claiming it. The other inmates gave Patricia wide berth out of fear. They gave Lynette space because something in their hindbrain warned them to. That was the problem. That was the threat. She looks at me like I'm a variable she hasn't bothered to calculate yet, Patricia told her second-in-command, Keisha, during their morning meeting in the shower room. Like I'm not even worth the math. Keisha, who'd spent 6 years as Patricia's enforcer, nodded slowly. She don't talk to nobody. Don't join no groups. Don't even seem scared. Exactly. Patricia's jaw tightened. Fear is respect in here. You take away the fear, you take away my currency. And that quiet bitch is walking around like fear is something that happens to other people. She'd tried the usual approaches. Staring her down in the corridor, Lynette's eyes had slid past her like she was furniture. Sending her crew to crowd Lynette's table at dinner, Lynette had simply waited until they got bored and left. Testing her with small provocations, stolen soap, a deliberately bumped shoulder in the shower line, and getting absolutely no reaction worth the effort. Every non-response made Patricia look weaker. Every moment Lynette remained untouchable, Patricia's grip on cell block D loosened another degree. It ends today, Patricia said. Lunch. Public. I want everyone to see what happens when you don't bend the knee in my house. The cafeteria was the perfect stage. Maximum visibility, maximum humiliation. Patricia had used it before to break stronger women than this silent newcomer. By the time she was done, Lynette Lewis would be just another lesson in what happened when you forgot who ran things. Lynette felt the shift the moment she entered the cafeteria. The air had changed, charged with anticipation, thick with the electricity that preceded violence. Every inmate in the room knew something was coming. The ones in blue were positioned strategically, blocking exits, creating a kill box around the center tables. The ones in orange had retreated to the walls, their survival instincts telling them to stay clear of whatever was about to happen. She ran the calculations in microseconds. 3 exits, all compromised. 17 hostile actors, positions mapped. For guards, attention deliberately diverted. This was an ambush with official permission, the kind of sanctioned violence that kept prison hierarchies stable. The smart play was to turn around. Request protective custody. Let the system handle Patricia Dicks through official channels that would take weeks, maybe months. But Lynette couldn't afford the attention. Protective custody meant interviews, paperwork, questions about why a woman on a minor fraud charge needed protection from general population. Questions led to scrutiny. Scrutiny led to people looking too closely at a cover story that wouldn't survive serious investigation. She had one option: walk through the trap and hope her training let her manage the fallout without revealing what she really was. Lynette took her tray from the serving line and walked into the center of the cafeteria. She chose a table in the open, exposed on all sides, and sat down with her back to Patricia's approach vector. The room held its breath. Patricia smiled and reached for the trash can. The performance was about to begin. The garbage hit Lynette's tray with a wet slap that echoed across the cafeteria. Coffee grounds mixed with spoiled milk. Banana peels sliding across institutional mashed potatoes, something that might have been meat 3 days ago, now decomposing into a gray-brown sludge. The smell was immediate and overwhelming, rot and fermentation, and the particular stench of waste that had been sitting in summer heat. Lynette didn't move. She kept her hands flat on the table, her breathing locked at 12 counts per minute, her eyes focused on the mess now covering her lunch. Around her, the cafeteria had gone silent in that particular way that happens when violence is promised and everyone wants to witness the breaking. You see that? Patricia's voice carried across the room like a prosecutor delivering closing arguments. That's respect. That's what happens when you forget where you are and who runs it. She leaned down, her face inches from Lynette's ear. Now you got a choice, new fish. You can eat it, or you can wear it. But either way, you're going to show this whole room that you know your place. Lynette reached for her plastic fork. The movement was slow, deliberate, completely devoid of the fear Patricia was expecting. She began separating the garbage from the portions of food that remained untouched, pushing aside the coffee grounds, isolating a section of green beans that had escaped contamination, methodically clearing a small space on her tray. The silence in the room shifted quality. This wasn't the script. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Patricia's face flushed red. Did you hear what I said? I'm talking to you. Lynette set down her fork with the kind of precision that suggested she was performing a complex mathematical equation rather than sitting in a prison cafeteria. She looked up at Patricia with eyes that had watched men die in Syrian basements, eyes that had calculated kill shots from rooftops in Mogadishu, eyes that held absolutely no fear because fear was an emotion you couldn't afford when you were the most dangerous person in the room. I'm just curious, Patricia, she said, her voice carrying that same temperature as the steel table. Does terrorizing new inmates give you the peace you lost on the outside? The question landed like a surgical strike. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't defensive. It was the kind of calm, clinical observation that suggested Patricia's entire performance was nothing more than data being collected and filed away. The tone stripped away the theater, the dominance display, the carefully constructed hierarchy, and reduced Patricia to exactly what she was. Someone desperately trying to control an environment because everything outside these walls had proven uncontrollable. Patricia's crew shifted uncomfortably. The inmates along the walls leaned forward. Even the guards stopped their fake busy work to watch. What did you just say to me? Patricia's voice had gone quiet, which was more dangerous than the yelling. Lynette had been counting on that. Rage was predictable. Rage made people sloppy. I'm just trying to understand the psychology, Lynette continued, her tone suggesting genuine academic interest. This need to establish dominance through ritualized humiliation. It's a trauma response, usually. Something taken from you, so you take from others. It's very human, very understandable. She was doing it deliberately now, using the language of analysis, of clinical assessment, stripping Patricia of her power by refusing to acknowledge it as legitimate. Every word was a precision cut, dissecting the bully's carefully constructed persona and laying bare the frightened woman underneath. Patricia's hands curled into fists. Her breathing had accelerated. Her weight had shifted forward onto the balls of her feet. Lynette cataloged every micro-expression, every physiological tell, building a complete threat profile in real time. You think you're smart? Patricia's voice shook with barely controlled fury. You think your fancy words change anything? I think, Lynette said quietly, that you're about to do something you'll regret. Patricia's right arm drew back, her entire body coiling for a punch that had broken jaws before. And Lynette simply waited. Patricia's crew closed in like wolves sensing wounded prey, but the wound wasn't Lynette's, it was Patricia's. Keisha moved to Lynette's left, blocking the nearest exit. 2 more enforcers flanked right, their positions calculated to prevent escape, to create the cage that made Patricia's dominance absolute. 5 women total, arranged in the formation they'd used a dozen times before, the choreography of institutional violence, so practiced it might as well have been ballet. But Lynette wasn't trying to escape. She was counting heartbeats, her own steady at 58 BPM, Patricia's racing somewhere north of 120. Elevated heart rate meant reduced fine motor control, compromised decision-making, telegraph movements. Patricia was running hot, which meant she was running predictable. You think this is funny? Patricia's voice had climbed an octave, the controlled menace giving way to something rawer. You think you can sit there with your smart mouth and your dead eyes and make me look weak in front of my people? Lynette rose from the bench in a single fluid movement that somehow managed to be both non-threatening and absolutely deliberate. She didn't break eye contact, didn't shift her weight defensively, didn't give Patricia's crew any excuse to escalate before Patricia made her move. She simply stood, bringing herself to her full height, 5'7" to Patricia's 5'9", and waited. The cafeteria had stopped pretending to eat. Every inmate, every guard, every person in that institutional space was watching the collision unfold with the sick fascination of people who knew they were witnessing something that would become legend. Lynette tracked Patricia's micro-expressions like a sniper reading wind patterns. The tightening around the eyes, pain response, old injury, probably left knee based on her weight distribution. The unconscious tongue movement across upper teeth. Pre-strike ritual, psychological preparation. The slight drop of her right shoulder before it drew back. The single frame of film that predicted the entire sequence. You know what your problem is? Patricia's voice had gone quiet again, but this time it wasn't control. It was the quiet before detonation. You're smart. Too smart. Smart enough to think you can logic your way out of physics. But I got 230 pounds of physics that says your brain don't matter when your jaw's wired shut. She was right, of course. In a straight fight, Patricia had every advantage. Weight, reach, experience with prison combat where rules were suggestions and survival was the only objective. Lynette's training had never been about winning fair fights. It had been about ending them before they started, or ending them so completely that fair never entered the equation. I run this block, Patricia snarled, and Lynette saw it in her eyes. The moment Patricia realized she was losing more than a confrontation. She was losing the psychological war, losing the mystique of invincibility, losing the currency of fear that kept her empire functioning. And you just invalidated my entire currency. So now I gotta spend some of yours. Patricia's right arm drew back, her entire body weight shifting behind it. It wasn't a prison punch, wild and desperate. It was a trained blow, something learned in boxing gyms or street fights where technique mattered. Her fist was already curling tight, knuckles aligned for maximum impact, trajectory aimed at Lynette's temple where bone was thin and concussions came easy. The crew tightened their circle. The guards' hands drifted toward radios but didn't quite reach them. Institutional permission to let this play out, to let the hierarchy reassert itself through violence the way it always had. Lynette watched Patricia's shoulder complete its backward arc. She calculated force vectors, impact points, the precise angle of deflection required. Her own hands remained relaxed at her sides, her breathing still locked at 12 counts, her expression suggesting nothing more than mild scientific interest. Patricia's arm began its forward trajectory, 230 pounds of fury compressed into a single devastating strike. And Lynette's training woke up. The punch came exactly as Lynette had calculated. Powerful, committed, telegraphed 3 frames before execution. Patricia's weight shifted forward onto her right foot. Her shoulder rotated through its full arc. Her fist accelerated toward Lynette's temple with enough force to crack orbital bones. It was a good punch. Technically sound. The kind that had ended fights in parking lots and prison yards for years. Lynette moved like water, finding the path of least resistance. There was no wind-up, no visible preparation, no dramatic counterstance. One moment she was standing still. The next she'd rotated exactly 17 degrees on her right heel, her head moving 4 inches outside the punch's trajectory while her hands, which had been relaxed at her sides, flowed upward with the mechanical precision of a machine executing programmed instructions. Her left hand intercepted Patricia's extended wrist, fingers wrapping around it not with strength, but with exact anatomical knowledge of where the radial nerve ran closest to bone. Her right hand continued upward in a smooth arc, the edge of her palm striking the brachial plexus nerve cluster in Patricia's shoulder with the kind of precision that came from 3,000 repetitions in training facilities that didn't appear on any government budget. The strike looked gentle, almost casual, like someone tapping a friend to get their attention. The effect was catastrophic. Patricia's entire right arm went dead. Not painful, not broken, just instantaneously disconnected from voluntary control. The neurological pathway from brain to muscle simply stopped functioning, her arm dropping to her side like meat hanging from bone. Her forward momentum, suddenly unsupported, carried her off balance while Lynette's grip on her wrist became the fulcrum for a joint lock so efficient it required almost no strength at all. Lynette stepped inside Patricia's collapsing guard, her movement placing her shoulder beneath Patricia's center of gravity. Physics did the rest. Patricia's weight, her momentum, her own muscle mass became the weapon used against her. Lynette guided her downward with the same care a parent might use lowering a child into bed, controlling the descent so Patricia's knees hit concrete without shattering patellae, but with enough force to make the point unmistakable. The entire sequence took 1.3 seconds. Patricia knelt on the cafeteria floor, her right arm hanging useless, her left hand reaching for it in confused desperation. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air, her brain trying to process what her body was telling her. This hadn't been a fight. This had been a specialized deactivation performed by someone who knew exactly which nerve clusters to target, exactly how much force to apply, exactly how to dismantle a human weapon system without causing permanent damage. Her crew stood frozen, watching their invincible leader kneel before a woman who hadn't even changed her breathing rate. Lynette maintained her grip on Patricia's wrist, keeping the joint lock active but not escalating. She leaned down, her voice barely audible beneath Patricia's gasping. "I'm going to let go now," Lynette said, her tone suggesting she was explaining a complex procedure to a confused patient. "Your arm will come back in about 90 seconds. Full function restored in 5 minutes. No permanent damage." She paused. "But we both know I could have done this differently. We both know what I chose not to do." She released the lock and stepped back, her hands returning to her sides, her posture suggesting the entire confrontation had been nothing more than a minor interruption to her lunch routine. Patricia swayed on her knees, her right arm beginning to tingle as neural pathways reconnected, her mind catching up to the reality her body had already accepted. She'd just attacked someone who operated on a completely different level. Someone trained not for prison fights or street brawls, but for surgical violence in places where nations pretended they didn't send people. The cafeteria remained silent, every witness understanding they'd just seen the power structure of cell block D collapse in 90 seconds. Lynette turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Patricia kneeling on the concrete floor like a disciple who'd just received revelation. The guards finally reached for their radios, but they were far too late. The administrative segregation cell measured 8 feet by 6 feet, concrete walls, steel toilet, thin mattress on a metal frame. Lynette had been in worse. The CIA safe house in Peshawar had been 4 by 4, no windows, temperature oscillating between freezing and cooking depending on which interrogation protocol they were running. This was practically luxury. She sat cross-legged on the mattress, back straight, hands resting palms up on her knees, and began the psychological debriefing protocol. Breath control first, slowing her heart rate from the elevated state combat always triggered, even combat that lasted 90 seconds. She counted backwards from 1,000, assigning each number a specific muscle group, releasing tension systematically from scalp to toes. The operative mindset was dangerous. It was a tool, necessary and effective, but it couldn't be left running in the background like software consuming resources. She'd seen agents burn out because they couldn't turn it off, couldn't stop reading threats in every civilian interaction, couldn't remember how to exist in spaces where everyone wasn't a potential hostile. She cataloged the incident frame by frame, analyzing each decision point. The nerve strike, necessary, minimal force, reversible damage. The joint lock, textbook execution, no improvisation required. The psychological messaging, calculated to establish boundaries without escalating to lethal territory. All within acceptable parameters. All defensible if her handlers ever reviewed the incident. 72 hours in ADSEG. 72 hours of silence that she used to rebuild the civilian cover, to remember how to be Lynette Lewis, convicted fraud, serving 6 months on a manufactured charge. Not Lynette Lewis, paramilitary operations officer, responsible for 3 terminated hostile assets and 2 successful extractions from non-permissive environments. By hour 68, she'd successfully suppressed the operative protocols back to accessible but dormant status. The weapon was sheathed. They released her on a Tuesday morning, and the cell block D she returned to was unrecognizable. Patricia's crew had dissolved like mist in sunlight. Keisha had requested transfer to another block. The enforcers who'd surrounded the cafeteria table now kept their eyes down when Lynette walked past. Patricia herself had been moved to protective custody after someone, prison rumors couldn't agree who, had left a shiv on her bunk with a note suggesting her regime had ended and certain debts needed settling. The power vacuum was immediate and absolute. Without Patricia's iron grip, the bloc had reorganized into smaller, less aggressive factions. Women who'd been terrorized for years suddenly found space to breathe. The systemic violence that had characterized Cell Block D for 8 years had simply evaporated. Clara watched Lynette unpack her belongings with the careful attention of someone trying to solve an equation. "They're calling you Ghost," she said quietly. "Word is you moved so fast the cameras barely caught it." Lynette didn't respond. She folded her spare uniform with precise hospital corners, the kind of automatic precision that came from military training no fraud convict should possess. "Sergeant Ramirez asked me about you," Clara continued. "Asked what you talk about. What you do all day." I told him you're boring as hell. Thank you. He didn't believe me. Clara's voice dropped to barely audible. He's been reviewing the footage from the cafeteria. Watched it maybe 50 times, they say. Brought in some outside consultant, former military or something, to analyze it. Lynette's hands paused for exactly 1 second before continuing their folding routine. And the consultant told him that what you did was impossible. Said it takes years of specialized training to pull off a takedown like that. Said the speed, the precision, the anatomical knowledge, it don't match your paperwork. In a secure office 3 floors above cell block D, Sergeant Antonio Ramirez played the footage for the 19th time that afternoon. Frame by frame. Lynette's rotation, 17 degrees. Her hand intercepting the wrist with perfect timing. The strike to the shoulder that dropped a 230-pound woman like someone had cut her strings. He paused on frame 47, where Lynette's face was visible in profile. No rage. No fear. No adrenaline spike. Just clinical assessment. The expression of someone performing a routine task they'd done 1,000 times before. Ramirez picked up his phone and dialed a number that connected to a federal building in Langley, Virginia. Someone needed to know that their ghost was visible. The woman appeared in the library on Thursday afternoon, settling into the chair across from Lynette with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. She was maybe 45, nondescript in the way that intelligence operatives learn to be. Average height, forgettable features, the kind of face that disappeared from memory 5 minutes after you stopped looking at it. She wore the civilian clothes of a contractor, not an inmate, and her visitor badge identified her as Sandra Weiss, Legal Consultation Services. Lynette didn't recognize her, which meant nothing. The world of covert operations was full of people who made careers out of being unrecognizable. Lynette Lewis, the woman said, not quite a question. She opened a legal folder but didn't look at it. I'm reviewing cases for potential appeals. Fraud conviction, 6-month sentence, unusually short for federal charges. I had a good lawyer. Lynette kept her eyes on her book, a thriller about Russian sleeper agents that was either hilarious or horrifying depending on how much you actually knew about the trade. Must have been expensive. Those kinds of lawyers usually come with the kind of connections that keep you out of prison entirely. Weiss leaned back, her posture suggesting casual conversation, but her eyes were doing the same threat assessment Lynette had done to Patricia. Unless, of course, you needed to be here. Lynette turned a page. Why would anyone need to be in prison? Lots of reasons. Witness protection, deep cover surveillance, or maybe just a convenient place to disappear while certain Senate investigations run their course. Weiss let that hang in the air for exactly 3 seconds before continuing. You made quite an impression in the cafeteria last week. That thing you did to Patricia Dicks, the brachial plexus strike, the joint manipulation, that's not something you learn in boxing gyms. The operational protocols Lynette had so carefully suppressed began warming up in her hindbrain. Weiss had used specific anatomical terminology. Either she had medical training or she'd watched someone break down the footage with professional expertise. I got lucky, Lynette said. Frame 47 lucky? Weiss smiled. The one where your face shows absolutely no adrenaline response? The kind of calm that only comes from extensive combat experience. Lynette closed her book and met Weiss's eyes directly. What do you want? I represent certain interests, private security, specialized risk management, and we occasionally need personnel with unique skill sets for sensitive projects. There's an inmate here, cell block B. She's awaiting trial on charges that could implicate some very important people. People who would prefer she never make it to testimony. You want me to kill someone? I want you to facilitate an accident. Heart attack, perhaps. You'd be amazed what stress and poor prison medical care can accomplish with the right encouragement. Weiss's smile never reached her eyes. Someone with your background, someone trained in pressure point manipulation, stress positions, psychological warfare, could make it look completely natural. Lynette's blood went cold. The offer itself wasn't surprising. Prison was full of people willing to trade violence for favors. What was surprising was the specific knowledge. Stress positions, psychological warfare. Those weren't terms civilians used. Those were terms from interrogation manuals that lived in classified databases. You know about Eritrea, Lynette said quietly. It wasn't a question. Weiss's smile widened. I know about a lot of things. The safe house in Peshawar. The extraction in Lagos. The Senate investigation into enhanced interrogation techniques that suddenly developed amnesia about certain operatives. She leaned forward. I know that Lynette Lewis, the fraud convict, is a convenient fiction. And I know that the woman who put Patricia Dicks on her knees is worth a considerable amount of money to the right people. The library suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in with the weight of exposure. Someone had connected the dots. Someone had access to classified operations, to mission reports that should have been buried under layers of clearance protocols and bureaucratic obfuscation. Someone knew exactly who and what she was. I'm not interested, Lynette said. You don't have to decide now. Think about it. Weiss stood, adjusting her visitor badge. But understand, people know you're here. People who trade in the kind of specialized violence you've spent 15 years perfecting. You can work with us, or you can wait for someone less polite to make you an offer you can't refuse. She walked away, leaving Lynette alone with the sudden, crushing understanding that her cover wasn't just compromised. It was actively being weaponized against her. They came for her in the laundry room on Saturday morning, during the 40-minute window when supervision was minimal and the industrial washers provided acoustic cover. Lynette had expected it. Weiss's offer had never been optional, and people who traded in coerced violence didn't accept refusal gracefully. 2 escorts flanked the door, both inmates, both with the hard-eyed competence of women who'd done this kind of work before. Weiss herself stood near the folding tables, no longer wearing the forgettable mask of a legal consultant. Now she just looked like what she was, a fixer who'd come to collect an asset that had declined to be collected. I was hoping we could avoid unpleasantness, Weiss said, pulling a sharpened screwdriver from her jacket pocket. Not prison-made. This was professional equipment, smuggled in through corrupted supply chains. But you've put me in an awkward position. My clients don't appreciate being told no. Lynette set down the sheet she'd been folding with the same careful precision she'd used to set down her fork in the cafeteria. The laundry room was 12 feet by 18 feet, 3 exits, all currently blocked. Industrial equipment limited movement options, but also provided cover and improvised weapons. 2 escorts plus Weiss equaled 3 hostiles, armed, trained enough to be dangerous but not trained enough to recognize what they were actually facing. Last chance, Weiss continued. Do the job, or we make it look like you tried to escape and things got violent. Lynette's response was movement, not toward the exits, but deeper into the laundry room where the industrial dryers created a narrow corridor. The escorts moved to intercept, which was exactly what she needed them to do. The first escort, stocky, tattoos suggesting gang affiliation, reached for Lynette's shoulder. Lynette trapped the reaching hand, rotated her entire body into the woman's space, and used the dryer's metal edge as the fulcrum for a joint lock that put the escort face first into the machine with enough force to open a cut across her forehead. Not lethal, not permanent, but very bloody. The second escort was smarter, hanging back, waiting for an opening. Lynette gave her one, a deliberate stumble that suggested the first takedown had thrown her off balance. The escort lunged with a prison shiv, a real one this time, the kind that could puncture organs. Lynette redirected the knife hand past her body, used the escort's momentum to drive her into the first escort, who was still disoriented and bleeding, and both women went down in a tangle of limbs that would look like a botched coordination rather than surgical manipulation. Weiss moved then, the screwdriver leading. She had training. The grip was correct. The approach angle suggested someone had taught her how to use edged weapons against resistant targets. But training wasn't experience, and experience was the difference between knowing how to execute a technique and understanding when your opponent was 3 moves ahead. Lynette stepped inside Weiss's attack arc, trapped her weapon arm against her own body, and executed a throw that put Weiss on the concrete floor hard enough to crack ribs. The screwdriver skittered away across the tile. Lynette was on her in seconds, one knee on Weiss's chest, her hand wrapping around the woman's throat with exactly enough pressure to restrict blood flow without crushing the trachea. Listen very carefully, Lynette whispered. You're going to leave this facility and never come back. You're going to tell your clients that I'm not available. And you're going to forget everything you think you know about me. She released the pressure slightly, letting Weiss gasp for air. Then she reached into Weiss's jacket and pulled out her phone. Not prison contraband, but an encrypted device that should never have made it through security. She scrolled through the messages, noting names, meeting locations, payment schedules. Perfect. Lynette pocketed a thumb drive she found clipped to Weiss's badge, likely containing the intelligence she'd used for blackmail, and replaced it with a duplicate she'd prepared days ago. This one contained carefully fabricated evidence linking Weiss to the corrupt guard network, to contraband smuggling operations, to the very prison corruption that had allowed her access in the first place. When internal investigations started, they'd find Weiss at the center of everything. Lynette stood surveying the scene. 2 inmates down, injuries consistent with a power struggle gone wrong. Weiss incapacitated, her equipment and evidence now pointing to internal conspiracy rather than outside recruitment. The narrative wrote itself. Criminals turning on each other, nothing to do with the quiet woman who'd been folding sheets in the corner. She returned to her folding station and waited for the guards to arrive. 5 minutes later, alarms began to sound. The investigation took 3 weeks to dismantle what had taken years to build. The thumb drive Lynette had planted led federal auditors through a labyrinth of corruption. Guards on private payrolls, contraband networks operating with institutional blessing, violence sanctioned as social control. Weiss disappeared into federal custody, her encrypted communications revealing connections that reached beyond Riverbend's walls into procurement contracts and construction bids. 2 guards were arrested. 4 more resigned before charges could be filed. The warden took early retirement. Cell Block D transformed in the vacuum. Without Patricia's iron grip, without the corrupt infrastructure that had enabled her reign, the violence simply evaporated. Women who'd spent years walking with heads down began making eye contact. The cafeteria lost its electric tension. The shower room stopped being a battleground. It wasn't peace exactly. Prison never achieved peace, but it was something closer to equilibrium. They moved Lynette to high security on a Tuesday morning, ostensibly for her protection. The official paperwork cited concerns about retaliation, about her safety in general population after the cafeteria incident. But everyone understood the real reason. The administration needed her isolated, contained, removed from a population that had started looking at her with the kind of respect that made institutional control complicated. Her new cell was 8 by 10, concrete and steel, a window that showed nothing but sky. She had it to herself, no cellmate, no daily interactions, just the careful distance of guards who'd watched the footage enough times to understand what she was capable of. They brought her meals. They conducted their counts. They left her alone. Lynette didn't mind the isolation. She'd spent 3 months in a Peshawar safe house with less space and worse ventilation. She used the silence to rebuild the civilian mask, to remember how to be someone who'd never calculated kill vectors or memorized guard rotations. By week 2, her breathing had returned to normal patterns. By week 3, the hypervigilance had dulled to manageable levels. By week 4, she could sleep without running threat assessments in her dreams. Clara visited once, escorted by guards who maintained careful distance. She sat across from Lynette in the visitation area and studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You look different," Clara said. Quieter somehow, like whatever was coiled up inside finally let go. Lynette smiled, a real smile, not the carefully constructed expression she'd worn for 3 months. "Maybe it did. They're saying you're a ghost. That you were never really here." Clara leaned forward. "Were you?" Lynette considered the question, weighing operational security against the debt she owed this woman who'd shared a cell and kept her secrets. "I was exactly where I needed to be," she said finally. "Doing exactly what I was supposed to do." Clara nodded, satisfied with an answer that wasn't really an answer. She stood to leave, then paused. "That thing you said about dangerous needing to be forgettable? You were right. The most dangerous thing in any room is the one that chooses not to move." After Clara left, Lynette returned to her cell and settled onto her bunk. 43 days had become 97, but the mission parameters had shifted. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't gathering intelligence or maintaining cover. She was simply existing in a space she'd carved out through controlled violence and surgical precision. A space where respect replaced fear, where silence became its own kind of power. Outside her window, the sky shifted from afternoon blue to evening gray. Somewhere in Cell Block D, women ate dinner without checking over their shoulders. Somewhere in an administrative office, her release paperwork was being processed, 6 months served good behavior, model inmate. Somewhere in Langley, handlers were closing files on operations that would never see daylight. Lynette closed her eyes and began her evening protocol, but this time it wasn't threat assessment or contingency planning. It was simply breathing. 12 counts in, 12 counts out, the rhythm of someone who'd finally achieved what she'd come here for. Not invisibility. Not forgetting. Peace.